Across North America's most remote hunting grounds, some men return home with trophies. Others don't return at all. From dense taiga to wind-blasted ridgelines, seasoned hunters have vanished, gone silent, or come back broken, whispering about things no one believes. Some say it's bears, wolves, or bad luck. But others speak of eyes that don't blink, footsteps with no body, and noises no animal should make. These are their stories, unedited and unforgettable. In this video, we will uncover 6 stories of grizzly attacks. From pure predator attacks to the unexplainable, each story gets stranger than the last. The remote forest land outside McGrath, Alaska, had witnessed its share of hunting expeditions over the decades, but nothing quite like what unfolded during the summer of 2025. This particular stretch of wilderness, characterized by dense, old-growth taiga extending 60 miles beyond the closest logging road, had remained largely untouched by human activity for generations. The area's isolation made it a prime destination for experienced hunters seeking untamed territory, where caribou herds migrated through ancient corridors carved by glacial movements thousands of years ago. Cole Renner, a 43-year-old hunting guide from Bozeman, Montana, had organized what he believed would be a routine early summer bow season expedition. His companions included Mason Hardwick, a veteran outdoorsman who had been tracking big game across North America for over 2 decades, Wyatt Temple, a skilled archer known for his precision with compound bows, and Jonas Braxley, whose expertise in wilderness survival had earned him respect among hunting circles throughout the Rocky Mountain region. The 4 men had hunted together for more than a decade, developing an unspoken understanding of each other's methods and maintaining an impressive safety record throughout their numerous expeditions. Their preparation had been meticulous, as always. Each hunter carried redundant satellite communication equipment, a bolt-action rifle as a backup weapon, and a comprehensive survival pack containing enough supplies for a week-long expedition. They had studied topographical maps for months, identified optimal camping locations near water sources, and coordinated their approach to minimize environmental impact while maximizing their chances of encountering the substantial caribou herds that frequented the area during early summer months. On the morning of July 2, 2025, the group established their base camp along a small, glacial-fed riverbed that provided fresh water and natural concealment. The location offered excellent visibility of game trails while remaining hidden from the wind patterns that typically carried human scent across the valley. By late afternoon, their patience had been rewarded when Wyatt successfully brought down a massive bull caribou weighing approximately 500 pounds, providing enough meat to sustain their expedition and justify the considerable expense of reaching such a remote location. The men followed established protocols for handling large game in bear country. They field dressed the animal immediately, carefully separating the meat from organs and entrails. The valuable cuts were secured in waterproof containers and hoisted high into a sturdy spruce tree using a pulley system they had perfected over years of similar expeditions. The remaining entrails were burned completely in a fire, eliminating the scent traces that might attract scavengers. Mason remarked that their precautions exceeded even the recommendations provided by the Fish and Game authorities, and the group felt confident they had minimized any potential risks. As darkness settled over the wilderness, the hunters maintained their usual evening routine. They checked their equipment, reviewed the planned routes for the following day, and settled into their sleeping arrangements with the satisfaction that came with a successful hunt. The temperature had dropped to a comfortable level, and the sounds of the forest provided a familiar backdrop that had lulled them to sleep on countless previous expeditions. Just past midnight, their world transformed into chaos. Something enormous crashed through their campsite with devastating force and unmistakable intent. The attack happened so quickly that the experienced hunters, despite their years of training and preparation, barely had time to process what was occurring. Cole later described the sound as unlike anything he had previously encountered, combining the breaking of branches with an otherworldly roar that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. Mason managed to reach his rifle and discharge a single shot before the massive grizzly bear overwhelmed their defensive positions. The animal showed no hesitation, no fear of human presence, and no response to the noise and commotion that typically drove even aggressive bears away from human encounters. Cole remembered thinking that this was not a defensive mother protecting cubs or a surprised animal reacting to perceived threats. This bear had approached their camp with deliberate purpose and deadly efficiency. The next coherent memory Cole retained was waking up 30 yards from their destroyed campsite, his body broken and bleeding from multiple wounds. His ribs were fractured, deep gashes covered his back, and he struggled to remain conscious as shock set in. The rescue team that located him 2 days later found the remains of his 3 companions scattered throughout the area, their bodies bearing evidence of an attack that exceeded anything in the documented history of bear encounters in Alaska. Wildlife officials who investigated the scene confirmed that the bear's behavior was unprecedented. The animal had not been interested in their food supplies or the caribou meat they had secured. The attack was motivated by something beyond territorial defense or food acquisition. Cole, after being airlifted to a hospital in Anchorage and spending weeks recovering from his injuries, insisted that the bear had come to kill, not to feed or defend itself. The experience fundamentally changed Cole's relationship with the wilderness he had loved for most of his adult life. Within a month of his release from the hospital, he sold every piece of hunting equipment he owned and never returned to the woods. He told investigators that some encounters with nature were not meant to be survived, and he had no intention of testing those boundaries again. The wilderness surrounding Kaministiquia, Ontario, had long served as prime moose hunting territory for generations of Canadian outdoors people. Located near the decommissioned logging routes that once connected Thunder Bay to the northern timber operations, this particular stretch of forest had been gradually reclaimed by nature since the 1970s. The area's dense pine groves and marshy clearings provided ideal habitat for the massive bull moose that migrated through the region during the fall rutting season, making it a destination of choice for experienced hunters seeking trophy-sized animals. Thomas McCready, a seasoned hunter from Winnipeg, had been visiting this area for over 15 years. His childhood friend Elliot Travers, who owned a small cabin construction business in Ontario, had joined him on numerous hunting expeditions throughout the decades. Their friendship had been forged through countless hours spent in similar wilderness settings as they developed an understanding of each other's hunting methods and established traditions that had become an integral part of their annual routines. In October 2006, the 2 men arrived at a prefab hunting cabin that had been constructed during the 1980s logging boom. The structure, though basic, provided adequate shelter from the harsh Canadian autumn weather. It lacked modern conveniences like electricity or running water, but its isolation from populated areas made it an ideal base for hunters seeking genuine wilderness experiences. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by towering pines whose branches created a natural canopy that filtered sunlight during the day and muffled sounds at night. For the first 3 days of their expedition, Thomas became increasingly aware of unusual disturbances around their campsite. He discovered large indentations in the pine duff that resembled footprints but were far too large to have been made by any known wildlife in the region. The spacing between the impressions suggested a stride length that exceeded anything he had encountered in decades of hunting throughout North America. He mentioned his observations to Elliot, who initially dismissed them as the result of fallen branches or natural settling of the forest floor. The absence of typical wildlife signs puzzled both hunters. They found no bear scat, no claw marks on trees, and no wolf tracks despite the presence of what appeared to be large predator prints. The forest seemed unusually quiet, lacking the normal sounds of small game and bird activity that typically indicated healthy ecosystem activity. Thomas later described the atmosphere as unnaturally subdued, as if the local wildlife had vacated the area entirely. On the fourth night of their expedition, both hunters were awakened by a rhythmic thudding sound that seemed to originate from multiple directions around their cabin. The noise resembled someone striking wood against tree trunks, but the pattern was too regular to be attributed to natural causes, such as falling branches or wind damage. The sounds continued for several hours, creating an unsettling percussion that made sleep impossible. Elliot decided to investigate the source of the disturbance, taking his hunting rifle and a powerful flashlight. Thomas remained at the cabin, monitoring the situation from inside while maintaining radio contact with his friend. When Elliot failed to respond to radio calls after 10 minutes, Thomas became concerned and ventured outside to locate him. He found Elliot standing motionless in the darkness approximately 50 yards from the cabin, whispering unintelligibly to himself. His friend appeared to be completely unaware of his surroundings, staring fixedly into the forest with an expression Thomas had never seen before. Elliot showed no signs of physical injury, but his behavior was entirely uncharacteristic. He remained unresponsive to Thomas's attempts to communicate with him, continuing to whisper words that made no sense. Thomas managed to guide his friend back to the cabin, where Elliot remained in a semi-catatonic state for the remainder of the night. The next morning, Elliot appeared to regain some awareness of his surroundings, but refused to discuss what had occurred during his time in the forest. Thomas decided to terminate their hunting expedition immediately, packing their equipment and driving back to civilization that same day. It took several days before Elliot would speak about the incident, and even then he provided only minimal details. He insisted that he had encountered something in the forest that was not human, but he refused to elaborate further. The experience had fundamentally altered his relationship with the wilderness he had enjoyed for most of his adult life. Within a year of the incident, Elliot sold his property in Ontario and relocated to an unknown destination, cutting contact with Thomas and their mutual friends. Thomas continued hunting in other locations but never returned to the area near Kaministiquia. He told wildlife officials that some encounters in the wilderness were not meant to be understood, and he had no interest in pursuing explanations for what they had experienced. The Bitterroot foothills of Montana had earned their reputation as some of the most challenging elk hunting territory in North America. These steep, forested ridgelines with scattered meadows provided ideal habitat for the massive Rocky Mountain elk that migrated through the region during their annual rutting season. The terrain demanded exceptional physical conditioning and hunting skills, which naturally limited the number of hunters willing to pursue elk in such demanding conditions. Derek Collum had been hunting elk in this specific area for over 20 years, beginning when he was barely out of his teens. His approach to elk hunting was methodical and solitary, preferring early morning hikes up ridgelines that most hunters avoided due to their extreme difficulty. He had developed an intimate knowledge of elk behavior patterns seasonal migration routes, and the subtle environmental cues that indicated the presence of mature bulls during the rutting season. In September 2013, Derek embarked on what he anticipated would be another successful solo elk hunt. His equipment included a precision Remington 700 rifle, a lightweight carbon fiber tripod for long-range shots, and a GPS tracking collar that his wife had insisted he wear after several previous expeditions had extended longer than originally planned. His hunting strategy involved establishing a base camp and systematically scouting vast areas of wilderness until he located a trophy-quality bull elk. By the second day of his expedition, Derek had identified a massive bull elk that exceeded anything he had encountered in 2 decades of hunting. The animal's antlers spread, and its body size indicated it was likely one of the largest elk in the entire region. However, each time he positioned himself for a clear shot, something would disturb the animal from the opposite direction, causing it to flee before he could complete his approach. The pattern repeated itself multiple times over the next 2 days. Derek would spend hours tracking the elk, positioning himself downwind, and preparing for a shot, only to have the animal spooked by some unseen presence that seemed to be monitoring his movements. He conducted a thorough reconnaissance of the area and found no evidence of other hunters operating in the vicinity, which made the consistent interference increasingly puzzling. On the 4th day of his hunt, Derek decided to deploy a trail camera to document any activity in the area where he had been encountering the elk. He positioned the motion-activated camera along a game trail that the bull had been using regularly, then established an observation point approximately 200 yards away where he could monitor the area without disturbing the elk's normal behavior patterns. The following morning, Derek retrieved the camera and reviewed the footage it had captured during the night. The images showed movement that defied logical explanation. The camera had recorded what appeared to be a human figure moving on all fours through the area, but the figure was covered in what looked like elk hide. The creature moved with an unnatural gait that suggested familiarity with the terrain, and it had passed directly through Derek's campsite while he was sleeping. The footage was disturbing enough that Derek immediately decided to terminate his hunting expedition. He packed his equipment and began the long hike back to his vehicle, abandoning several $100s worth of specialized hunting gear in his haste to leave the area. He later told hunting companions that the images on the camera had shown something that challenged his understanding of what was possible in the wilderness. Derek never reported the incident to wildlife authorities or hunting organizations, explaining that he preferred not to discuss what he had documented. He also decided to leave the trail camera in the forest rather than retrieving it, stating that he had no desire to discover what additional footage it might have captured during subsequent nights. The experience fundamentally altered Derek's approach to elk hunting. While he continued to hunt in other locations throughout Montana, he never returned to the Bitterroot foothills where he had been successful for so many years. He told his wife that some mysteries in the wilderness were better left unsolved, and he had no intention of pursuing explanations for what he had witnessed. Fellow hunters who knew Derek described the change in his demeanor as significant. A man who had previously been eager to share hunting stories and techniques became reluctant to discuss his experiences in detail. He continued to hunt elk in other regions, but never again attempted solo expeditions in remote wilderness areas. The trail camera remained in the forest where Derek had abandoned it, and its location was never disclosed to other hunters or researchers who might have been interested in investigating the unusual footage it had captured. The mountainous terrain of Southwest Virginia has long been recognized as prime habitat for eastern wild turkeys, particularly during the spring mating season when mature gobblers become more active and responsive to calling techniques. The region's dense Appalachian hardwood forests, interspersed with natural clearings and abundant berry patches, provided ideal conditions for both turkey populations and the black bears that inhabited the same ecosystem. Peter Holcomb had been pursuing wild turkeys throughout the southeastern United States for over 15 years, developing expertise in calling techniques and understanding the behavioral patterns that made spring turkey hunting both challenging and rewarding. His approach emphasized patience and stealth, often requiring him to remain motionless for hours while attempting to lure mature gobblers within range of his shotgun. In May 1998, Peter established a hunting camp in the hills of Southwest Virginia, focusing on an area where he had successfully harvested turkeys during previous seasons. The terrain was familiar to him, consisting of steep ridgelines covered with mature oak and hickory trees that provided abundant mast crops for wildlife. Natural springs and small streams created the wet areas where turkeys frequently gathered during early morning and late evening hours. His equipment for turkey hunting was specifically selected for the unique requirements of the sport. He carried a specialized shotgun loaded with turkey-specific ammunition designed for precise shot patterns at moderate ranges. Unlike hunters pursuing larger game, Peter was not equipped with weapons suitable for defending against large predators, as encounters with dangerous wildlife were relatively uncommon in the region during daylight hours. On the morning of the incident, Peter had positioned himself in a natural blind created by fallen logs and dense underbrush. He was using a combination of slate calls and mouth calls to attract turkeys. This technique required subtle variations in tone and timing to mimic the vocalizations of a hen turkey effectively. The calling sequence had been productive, with several distant gobbles indicating the presence of mature birds in the area. As Peter continued his calling routine, he became aware of movement in the forest approximately 50 yards from his position. Initially, he assumed the approaching animal was a turkey responding to his calls. Still, the sound of breaking branches and heavy footsteps indicated something much larger was moving through the underbrush. A black bear weighing approximately 250 pounds emerged from the forest and began walking directly toward Peter's position. The bear's approach was deliberate and showed no signs of the wariness that typically characterized black bear behavior around humans. Peter immediately attempted to deter the animal using standard wildlife encounter protocols, shouting and making aggressive gestures designed to convince the bear that he represented a threat. The bear continued its approach without any visible reaction to Peter's defensive actions. It paused approximately 10 feet from his position, lifted its head to test the air currents, then began what appeared to be a deliberate charge. Peter realized that his shotgun, loaded with ammunition designed for turkey hunting, would be ineffective against a bear except at extremely close range. He managed to discharge one shot as the bear closed the distance between them, striking the animal in the face and causing it to stumble momentarily. However, the light turkey loads failed to stop the bear's advance, and Peter was forced to abandon his equipment and flee down the steep hillside. He dropped his hunting vest and turkey decoy kit during his retreat, hoping the abandoned items might distract the bear and slow its pursuit. The bear followed Peter for over a mile through dense forest, maintaining a pace that suggested determination rather than defensive aggression. Peter later described the pursuit as unlike any wildlife encounter he had experienced in decades of hunting throughout the southeastern mountains. The bear seemed unaffected by the rough terrain and showed no signs of abandoning its pursuit. Only after Peter reached a substantial creek and fell into the water did the bear finally halt its pursuit. The animal stood on the bank for several minutes, observing Peter's position in the water, before finally turning and disappearing back into the forest. Peter remained in the creek for nearly an hour before feeling confident enough to emerge and begin the long walk back to his vehicle. Wildlife officials who investigated the incident suggested that the bear might have been suffering from rabies or partial blindness that could have affected its normal behavior patterns. However, Peter insisted that the animal's eyes appeared normal and that its actions seemed purposeful rather than confused or disoriented. The encounter fundamentally changed Peter's approach to turkey hunting. He began carrying bear spray and high-powered sidearms during subsequent hunting trips, and he avoided hunting alone in areas known to support large bear populations. He told fellow hunters that the bear's behavior had been unlike anything documented in wildlife management literature, suggesting that some animal encounters could not be explained by conventional understanding of predator behavior. The high desert wilderness of southeastern Oregon near Lakeview represented some of the most challenging mule deer hunting territory in the Pacific Northwest. The region's unique ecosystem, characterized by sparse pine and juniper forests interspersed with sagebrush flats and rocky outcroppings, supported healthy populations of mule deer that had adapted to the harsh environmental conditions. Late fall hunting seasons attracted experienced hunters seeking trophy-quality bucks that had survived multiple hunting seasons in this unforgiving landscape. Harley Givens had organized a hunting expedition that included his longtime friends Louis Baines and Doug Carter, all of whom had been hunting together for over a decade. The three men had secured access to privately leased hunting land that encompassed several thousand acres of prime mule deer habitat. Their hunting strategy involved establishing a base camp and systematically hunting different areas throughout a week-long expedition. The weather during November 2021 had been particularly harsh, with early winter storms bringing freezing temperatures and occasional snow flurries that made hunting conditions challenging. However, the severe weather also concentrated deer in sheltered areas, potentially improving the hunters' chances of encountering mature bucks that might otherwise remain hidden in more dispersed locations. The first 2 days of their expedition proceeded according to their established routine. The hunters split up each morning to cover different terrain, maintaining radio contact and meeting at predetermined locations throughout the day. They had spotted several deer, including a few mature bucks, but had not yet had clear shooting opportunities under the challenging weather conditions. Their camp was situated in a natural clearing surrounded by dense stands of juniper and pine trees. The location provided excellent visibility of the surrounding terrain while offering protection from the harsh winds that swept across the high desert. During evening hours, they would review their hunting plans and share observations about deer movement patterns they had noted during the day. On their third day in the field, the hunters began noticing unusual signs that suggested human presence in the area. They discovered arrangements of sticks that had been deliberately placed in perfect circular patterns, clearly not the result of natural processes or wildlife activity. The circles were found in multiple locations throughout their hunting area, always in clearings where they would be easily visible to anyone passing through the region. Luis was the first to discover what appeared to be symbols carved into the bark of several large pine trees. The markings were crude but deliberate, consisting of geometric patterns that seemed to form a trail through the forest. The symbols appeared fresh, suggesting they had been created recently rather than being remnants of historical human activity in the area. More disturbing were the animal bones they found hanging from tree branches at various heights throughout the forest. The bones appeared to be from deer and elk, but they had been arranged in ways that suggested ritualistic or ceremonial purposes rather than natural predator activity. The bones showed no signs of recent scavenging, and their placement in the trees would have required human intervention. The hunters began to feel increasingly uncomfortable as they discovered more evidence of human presence. They found what appeared to be makeshift shelters constructed from natural materials, hidden in dense vegetation where they would be difficult to spot from a distance. The shelter showed signs of recent use, including cold fire pits and disturbed ground that suggested overnight occupation. During their third night, all three hunters reported hearing unusual sounds that seemed to come from multiple directions around their camp. The sounds included what they described as human-like vocalizations that were not quite speech, but contained patterns that suggested a form of communication. The noises continued intermittently throughout the night, making restful sleep difficult and creating an atmosphere of unease that affected all three men. The following morning brought an unsettling discovery that would haunt the hunters for the remainder of their expedition. Doug found fresh footprints in the soft earth around their camp perimeter, but the prints were unlike anything he had encountered in years of wilderness experience. The impressions were generally human-like in shape, but exhibited unusual characteristics in size and depth, suggesting that the person making them had been walking barefoot despite the freezing temperatures. Harley attempted to photograph the prints with his digital camera, but the images came out consistently blurred despite clear lighting conditions and steady hands. Multiple attempts to document the footprints resulted in the same inexplicable photographic failures, as if something was interfering with the camera's ability to focus on the impressions. This technical malfunction was particularly frustrating because all three hunters had witnessed the prints clearly with their own eyes. The hunters also discovered that their food supplies had been disturbed during the night, despite their careful practice of storing all provisions in sealed containers hung from tree branches to prevent interference from wildlife. Several items were missing entirely, while others had been moved and rearranged in ways that suggested deliberate organization rather than random scavenging by animals. Most disturbing was the discovery of what appeared to be gifts left in exchange for the missing food items. Small carved wooden objects had been placed near their camp, featuring intricate geometric patterns that matched the symbols they had found carved into tree bark throughout the area. The craftsmanship was sophisticated, suggesting considerable skill and a significant investment of time in its creation. Luis reported feeling constantly watched throughout the fourth day, describing a persistent sensation of being observed from concealed positions in the dense forest surrounding their hunting areas. His attempts to locate the source of this surveillance proved unsuccessful, but the feeling intensified as the day progressed and began to affect his ability to concentrate on hunting activities. The hunters made a collective decision to modify their hunting strategy, staying closer together and maintaining more frequent radio contact than they usually did. They established a buddy system that required each hunter to check in every 30 minutes, a precaution that proved prescient given the events that would unfold that evening. On the fourth evening of their expedition, the hunters noticed smoke rising from a location approximately 2 miles from their camp. None of them had built fires in that area, and they were certain no other hunters were operating under the same land lease agreement. The smoke appeared to be emanating from multiple small fires rather than a single large campfire, creating a pattern inconsistent with typical camping or hunting activities. That night, Doug Carter failed to return to camp after an afternoon hunting session. His companions became concerned when he did not respond to radio calls or appear at their designated meeting location. They followed his tracks from camp into the tree line where the trail led approximately 300 yards before disappearing entirely on rocky ground that would not retain footprints. The search continued throughout the night, with Harley and Luis using flashlights and calling Doug's name repeatedly. Their efforts were complicated by what they later described as disturbing audio phenomena. They heard what sounded like human voices mimicking their calls, creating echoes that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. The voices reproduced their words with such accuracy that they initially assumed Doug was responding to their search efforts. As dawn approached, the two remaining hunters decided to hike out and contact the search and rescue authorities. The 10-mile trek to their vehicle required several hours, during which they continued to hear the strange voice phenomena that had plagued their search efforts throughout the night. They later described the experience as psychologically unsettling, as the voices seemed to be studying their speech patterns and reproducing them with increasing accuracy. Doug Carter was located by search and rescue personnel 2 days later, approximately 10 miles north of where he had disappeared. He was found alive but severely dehydrated and suffering from exposure to the cold weather. His boots were missing and his feet showed signs of extensive walking over rough terrain. Despite his physical condition, he remained coherent and was able to communicate with the rescue workers. Doug's explanation of his experience was limited and confusing. He claimed that he had been guided to his location by someone who had never allowed him to see their face. According to his account, this person had provided direction and encouragement throughout a journey that had taken him far from his original location. He reported that his guide had repeatedly told him that he was almost out of danger, suggesting that his displacement had been intentional rather than accidental. Medical examination revealed no signs of head trauma or other injuries that might have caused confusion or disorientation. Doug's refusal to provide additional details about his experience frustrated both search and rescue personnel and his hunting companions. He maintained that he had been helped rather than harmed, but he would not elaborate on the identity or motivations of his alleged guide. The three hunters never reunited for subsequent hunting expeditions. Doug's experience had created a permanent rift in their friendship, and none of them returned to the area where the incident had occurred. Luis and Harley continued hunting in other locations, but avoided remote wilderness areas where they might encounter similar unexplained phenomena. The northern plains surrounding Williston, North Dakota, presented some of the most challenging fur trapping conditions in the continental United States. The region's vast expanses of flat snowfields, broken only by scattered cottonwood shelter belts and frozen creek beds, created an environment where winter survival demanded both extensive knowledge of local conditions and respect for the harsh realities of sub-zero temperatures. During the peak fur season, experienced trappers could earn a substantial income from coyote pelts, provided they possessed the necessary skills and equipment to operate in such demanding conditions. Graham Nestor had been running trap lines throughout the northern plains for over 20 years, developing expertise in coyote behavior and trapping techniques that made him one of the most successful fur trappers in the region. His trap circuit spanned dozens of square miles, necessitating snowmobile transportation and meticulous documentation of trap locations to ensure efficient operation and compliance with state regulations. In January 1994, Graham was joined by his teenage nephew, Clint Rowan, who was spending winter break learning the fundamentals of fur trapping. The decision to include Clint in the expedition was motivated partly by family obligation and partly by Graham's belief that young people should understand the traditional skills that had sustained rural communities for generations. The timing coincided with a particularly severe cold snap that had driven coyote populations to concentrate in areas where they could find adequate food sources and shelter. Their operation involved checking and resetting traps along a predetermined route that utilized natural travel corridors used by coyotes as they moved between feeding and denning areas. The process required precise timing and weather awareness, as prolonged exposure to the extreme cold could be fatal for both humans and the animals they were pursuing. The first day proceeded as expected. Graham demonstrated proper trap placement techniques, explaining how wind patterns affected scent distribution and how subtle variations in terrain influenced animal movement. Clint proved to be an attentive student, asking thoughtful questions about reading animal signs and understanding the relationship between weather conditions and trapping success. Their first night's camp was established in a sheltered draw where cottonwood trees provided both windbreak and concealment. The second day brought the first indicators that something was different about this particular trapping expedition. Graham noticed that several of their trap sets had been investigated, but not triggered, with careful paw prints circling the devices at distances that suggested unusual caution. The snow around these locations showed patterns of movement that indicated the animals had spent considerable time examining the traps from multiple angles before departing without attempting to access the bait. That evening, as they prepared their second camp, Clint mentioned that he had seen movement in his peripheral vision throughout the day. When pressed for details, he described fleeting glimpses of tan and gray forms that seemed to parallel their snowmobile route at distances of several hundred yards. Graham initially attributed these sightings to the heightened awareness that often accompanies wilderness travel, but he made a mental note of the consistency in Clint's observations. The third day revealed a pattern that challenged Graham's understanding of coyote behavior. Multiple traps had been triggered without capturing animals, but the mechanism of trigger activation suggested deliberate manipulation rather than accidental contact. The animals appeared to be testing the trap's sensitivity and learning how to extract bait without setting off the capture mechanisms. This level of problem-solving ability exceeded anything Graham had encountered in 2 decades of experience with coyote behavior. More disturbing was the evidence of what appeared to be coordinated scouting activity. Tracks in the snow showed that multiple animals had approached their camp during the night, maintaining positions just beyond the range of their campfire light. The tracks formed a rough semicircle around their tent, suggesting that the animals had been working together to gather information about the human presence rather than simply investigating potential food sources. After 3 days of running their trap line, Graham began noticing irregularities that suggested unusual coyote behavior. Traps were being triggered without capturing animals, and some traps had been moved from their original positions despite being securely anchored. The bait they were using, consisting of beaver chunks known to be highly attractive to coyotes, was disappearing without leaving typical scavenging signs that would indicate how the animals had accessed the food. The pattern of missing bait and triggered traps extended throughout their entire trap circuit, suggesting either equipment malfunction or coordinated animal behavior that exceeded anything Graham had encountered in 2 decades of trapping experience. He conducted thorough inspections of their trap sets and found no evidence of human interference or equipment problems that might explain the unusual activity. Clint began reporting that he was seeing eyes reflecting their flashlight beams outside their tent during nighttime hours. His description suggested multiple animals positioned around their campsite, maintaining positions just beyond the range of their lighting equipment. Graham initially dismissed these reports as typical wildlife curiosity, but the pattern of nighttime observation continued and intensified over several consecutive nights. On their final night in the field, both trappers experienced what Graham later described as the most unsettling wildlife encounter of his career. They were surrounded by a coyote pack that numbered at least 15 animals, far larger than typical coyote groups, and displaying behavior that contradicted established understanding of coyote social structure and hunting patterns. The animals positioned themselves just beyond the range of their campfire light, forming what appeared to be a deliberate perimeter around the human camp. Rather than displaying typical predator behavior, such as aggressive posturing or retreat in response to human presence, the coyotes remained stationary and silent, simply observing the two humans for hours without any apparent agenda beyond surveillance. Graham reported that the experience felt like being studied by intelligent observers rather than confronted by wild animals. The coyotes were assessing the humans' numbers, equipment, and capabilities in a manner that suggested strategic thinking rather than instinctive behavior. Their positioning and coordination indicated a level of organization that exceeded anything documented in wildlife management literature. The coyotes maintained their positions throughout most of the night, never approaching close enough to represent an immediate threat, but retreating far enough to allow the humans to relax. The psychological impact of being watched by such a large group of predators for an extended period created stress levels that made sleep impossible and rational decision-making difficult. Graham decided to terminate their trapping expedition early, packing their equipment and leaving the area before dawn. He later told other trappers that the coyotes' behavior had suggested an intelligence and organizational capability that challenged his understanding of predator behavior. The experience convinced him that the animals had been counting the humans and assessing their vulnerability in ways that indicated sophisticated reasoning abilities. Neither Graham nor Clint returned to that area during the remainder of the 1994 fur season. Graham continued trapping in other locations throughout North Dakota, but avoided the region where they had encountered the unusually large and organized coyote pack. He told fellow trappers that some wildlife encounters provided insights into animal behavior that were better left unexplored, and he had no desire to test the limits of coyote intelligence and organization.